Trauma is something we hope we never have to deal with. It can be utterly devastating and debilitating and often completely consumes rational thought. But do you necessarily recognise that you're suffering? And how do you get over it when perhaps you don't even want to?
Yeah, you won't feel miraculously better overnight, and it won't happen at all unless you work on it. That's according to Relationships Australia Ambassador Cynthia Morton, who joins us now. Good morning, Cynthia.
Good morning. What are the kinds of trauma that the average person might experience?
Well, I really believe we have an emotional body. So there are many different ways that people are often the walking wounded and they don't realise it. One can be, you know, obviously domestic violence or sexual abuse. There can be forms of emotional abandonment or separation from a family, like foster care or the stolen generation. They're very powerful forms of traumatising the heart. Also witnessing, I mean, people that witnessed 9/11, I mean, that was a traumatic event. So when you go into overload, where you see something that is not sort of every day and it's catastrophic. So there are people that have also had death of a loved one, death of a sibling. You know, I've worked with people that have had their twin brother die and they're sent away to their aunts and the brother's buried and they come back and not to mention the name again. These things are traumatic.
The same, but it's so different.
So these things all traumatise us.
So typically, do people recognise that they are in fact suffering from trauma?
Many don't, and this is where, you know, you'll hear of the term post-traumatic stress disorder. There are many people today that are high achievers that live in what I call the realm of the physical and the intellectual, because emotionally there's just too much pain. So they have, you know, you've probably heard me mention it before, weapons of mass distraction. And they often, you hear them say, oh God, it happened 30 years ago, get over it. But getting back to the analogy of the fact that we have an emotional body like a physical body, if we take a trauma to the body, I mean, our body can be wounded and we can put a band-aid on it and look after it at home. But if you're in a car accident or you have a break, you need a surgeon and you need a physio and you need to rehabilitate, because, you know, the human body needs to heal. When you take a trauma to the heart, like something like this happens, and you don't deal with it, you try and put a band-aid on it through drugs, alcohol, or just denial, you become the walking wounded. And so what happens for many people, they obsess in other areas so they don't have to look at it, or they numb it off with drugs and alcohol, or they give up on love, they give up on feeling.
Oh, and that's the saddest part of all, isn't it? How do we help those people? Because I think we all know someone who has held on to trauma and grief for a long time, but who, and I think it's probably particularly poignant when they've lost a loved one and they don't actually want to get on with it. They don't want to forget that person. How can we encourage those people to deal with what they've lost and make a useful and positive and happy life for themselves?
Well, and again, it comes down to willingness, and I think often grief is a part of the human condition, and grief is something that I believe we need what I call an emotional surgeon to help us through, because it's overwhelming. And so if it's a loss of, I mean, I can only imagine what the grief of a loss of a child would be like, and I hope I never have to have that experience. But grief of a child or a loved one, I mean, the heart takes a bullet. Now, in honouring that loss, I mean, we go through different stages of grieving, but many people get stuck. And grief is such a huge emotion. I often say it feels like a tsunami wave in the beginning. Like when you're at the fury, you feel like you're going to drown.
Okay, so when you are drowning, how can you reach up for a life buoy? How do you get yourself out?
Well, I think in the beginning, just having someone that can sit with you in it and not minimise nor catastrophise it, not panic. Grief is a normal human emotion when there's loss. And I think if you've got supports around you where you can cry the tears, you can disconnect, you can have doona days where you just turn the world off and cry it out.
That person has to be a safe person, though, doesn't it?
Has to be a safe person. And if you don't have a safe person around you, you'll have people say, oh, for God's sake, stiff up a lip. You know, they'd want you to carry on, get on with it. And they don't go through...
Be brave. How often do you hear that at a funeral?
Yeah,
be
suck
brave.
it up, you know, build a bridge, get over it. And so if you don't go through the natural processes of grief and you sort of freeze and put it on pause, you become emotionally immobilised. You can't fall in love again. I mean, you cannot move through it.
You mentioned earlier there needs to be a willingness here. It's not going to work if the person isn't willing?
It's like anything, you know. So you need to be willing to ask for help, and I think that the thing is we've got to be very careful when people are in a state of grief. You've got to be gentle, not shaming, and not self-righteous. You know, and I think there is a formula for recovery, and this is why Relationships Australia and clinical people. I work with a lot of people that say, I'm not going to talk to a bloody therapist. They don't know my pain. They don't know what I'm going through.
But they know the first step, don't they?
Well, they know the formula. When you are physically wounded in a car accident, you know, I actually, you know, if I've broken my femur, I actually don't want a surgeon that's got a broken femur too. You know, I want a surgeon that just knows his stuff and can fix me. So, you know, knows the recovery process for that dynamic. And so what a clinician actually is like an emotional surgeon. They can walk you through, keep you safe and help you go through the healing process, like a physio then with the rehabilitation, so you can get to the other side. And the thing is, you can then honour the love or the loss without being immobilised by it.
And that's, I think, probably the saddest part of all, is that people so often are immobilised for the rest of their lives, and we all hear stories of people never actually getting over it.
Yeah.
What is emotional recycling?
Emotional recycling is, I often say, when I'm working with people that are in a detox or a rehab, or they've had some horrible trauma go on, I often say that manure makes great fertiliser. If you want to grow roses, you need some manure. So whenever a crisis happens, and it's very, you know, and I'm certainly not trying to minimise it, whenever a crisis happens, often if people have worked through it and learnt how to self-care through it, they progress and become wiser. If they give up and pretend it's not happening, they regress. So emotional recycling is actually using the pain constructively. Any woman that's given birth will tell you, you know, you go with the contractions, you know, you go with the pain to get through the other side. And so, you know, I often say pain is the you know, the gift that nobody wants. If you look back, you know, yeah, you know, so emotional recycling is actually not fighting it, going with it, recognising it, moving through it, so that, you know, on the other side of it, you've got this wisdom. And what you do when you actually move through pain is you develop a form of self-respect. Like riding the wave of grief, I say to people when you first start, it's going to feel like a tsunami. But if you work with a surgeon, they'll help you use your emotional muscles so at least you don't go under.
Yes.
And grief, then what happens is you actually learn to ride it in time, and you know, you still feel grief. You never not grieve for someone you've loved and lost, but it doesn't swallow you.
How important are weapons of mass distraction?
Well, being someone who's actually dabbled in myself, I think that you know, often when you see people going through crisis, they reach for a bottle, or they might reach for a behaviour, or they become obsessive about work, or they become obsessive about exercise. I think they're a form of coping mechanism, but I think, again, getting stuck in coping, you know, using external things to cope with internal issues is...
Sorry, I would imagine that those people that turn to alcohol or drugs as a weapon of mass distraction to cope with this, it's like going through it twice, trying to get them to come out of that dependency and then face the trauma. Must be twice as hard.
Well, in a way, I often say when I'm working with clinical people that you know, having come from a life of recovering from addiction and starting over myself, often what happens is drugs and alcohol keep a lot of people alive and in pain management if they haven't got any other support. So it's like a crutch. So you're absolutely right. You take that crutch away. When I took drugs and alcohol away, the sewerage of all the trauma and violence that happened to me as a little girl came up. So what drugs and alcohol do, it's a little bit like putting a bandage on, you know, a snake bite or a wound that's infected. You know, it's a bandage short-term approach, but if you never get care, what happens is the bandage becomes, or the crutch, the weapon of mass distraction, becomes a problem within itself. So you haven't just got the wound, you've then got an infection. So you're absolutely right. You've then got to deal with the initial trauma and the denial of that trauma. So you know, it becomes, you know, difficult.
I'm also fascinated by the poison state of resentment.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, often when people get stuck in a state of blame, when we're focusing on other people, it's other people's fault. It's all about fault and blame and resentment. What happens is you get stuck on focusing on that, and you don't actually do any healing yourself.
So they're externalising.
Yeah, and it's all about being a victim. And so while we're in a state of victimhood, we're disempowered. So I often sort of say, people say, I'm not going to forgive that. It's unforgivable. Some things are unforgivable, but for me, forgiveness has been about, I often say, it's about taking your hand off the other person's throat. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to condone it. But resentment's like, me drinking poison and waiting for you to die. I mean, I'm the one that suffers. So getting stuck in blame, I mean, good things, bad things happen to good people all the time. Most people spend the second half of their life getting over the first. I mean, we've all got stuff. We've all got emotional stuff. It's just in varying degrees. So when we stay stuck in blaming, he wrecked my life, she was unfaithful, I went bankrupt. When you remain stuck in blaming those things, you disempower yourself.
Yeah.
Just before we go, the Tapestry of Trauma conference?
It's great. It's a conference happening in Brisbane, and we've got some international experts coming out, but talking about, because a lot of people don't know they're the walking wounded, or they don't understand trauma, or they don't know how to help someone who's in a state of trauma. So there's a great website for people wanting to learn more about that. It'll be very interesting.
Yep, tapestryoftrauma.com.au. Thank you so much, Cynthia.
Thank you for having me.